I'd like to talk now about Plato's views of democracy. Democracy, rule by the people, something assumed by many people today as obviously the best form of government. In Plato's estimation, it is next to worst. The best is an aristocracy, rule by the best. The next best is timocracy, rule by those who are concerned with honor. The third best is oligarchy, rule by the wealthy. Democracy, he thinks, is worse than any of those. It tends to evolve out of an oligarchy. Why? Well, partly because of the class divisions between poor and rich that are really central to the whole idea of an oligarchy. It sometimes arises peacefully as the oligarchy begins to yield. Basically, the poor so far outnumber the rich that maybe the rich make concessions. Or maybe it happens violently through a revolution where the poor rise up and overthrow the rich. However it happens, the rich become more and more self-indulgent. They become less and less worthy of honor and respect from the rest of the people, and the divides eventually become too strong. The state, which really consists of a variety of different groups, it has no unity, there is no sense of a common goal, it eventually falls apart, and the people take charge. Now, when that happens, you might think that the people would naturally pursue their own interests and that this would be a good form of government. And Plato says for a while that seems to be true. For a while it looks as if a democracy is the very best form of government. But it doesn't last. It's not really sustainable, he thinks. So let's see why that's true. In an oligarchy, we have rule by the wealthy. As time goes on, the wealthy reveal themselves as no better at governing than many of the poor would be. In fact, they often reveal themselves as worse. They become soft. They become self-indulgent. And so they end up being less virtuous than the average person, or at least than many people among those who are poor. And so not only do they lose respect in the sense that people no longer feel a moral obligation to obey them, they actually lose respect for them in a more fundamental sense. They get the sense, these are not good people, they're not virtuous people, they're not people I want to look up to or pay attention to. And so the wealthy end up losing the respect of the people, and the people end up taking charge. They recognize that they are often stronger physically, stronger morally, stronger in terms of character than those who are their leaders, and so they reject their leadership. And initially, that does turn out to be a very good state. The people are more capable, and so when they install popular leaders in charge of them, those leaders tend initially to be better than the people they've replaced in an oligarchy. So it looks as if when you make the transition from oligarchy to democracy that it's an improvement. And it may well be in the short term, but Plato says it doesn't quite last. Here's what tends to happen. He says at first the democratic state allows people of any birth, any class, to attain political power. Now sometimes that happens by lot, as it did in ancient Athens. They recognized elections were not to be trusted, and so it was simply random who got to serve as a representative of the people. I think there's a serious argument to be made that actually that is a better system than the kind of system that we tend to have in most Western countries that actually selects people who are highly narcissistic and deeply ambitious. But however that may be, sometimes it's through election, sometimes it's through appointment, sometimes it's through lot. There might be a variety of mechanisms that a democracy uses to install people in positions of political authority. However that goes, initially it may seem as if that's good. People from all classes, people from all backgrounds can all be represented, and so it all looks good for a bit. A democracy tends to allow a great deal of freedom. It allows freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. It allows a variety of other freedoms that seem to give it a great advantage over other forms of government, and indeed that are essential to a functioning democracy. You can't really have a functioning democracy if you don't allow people to think, to speak, and to gather with other like-minded people as they so choose. That's vital to the entire democratic process. And so it's an advantage of a democracy. It's also a necessary condition for a democracy. Plato says that everyone would arrange a plan for leading his own life in the way that pleases him. In a democratic society, the result would be the most beautiful of polities, as a garment of many colors embroidered with all kinds of hues. So, for a while, it looks like democracy is superb. But it can't be sustained. Why not? Plato says, essentially, it becomes too tolerant. It begins to allow so much freedom that it tolerates things it should not tolerate. And that leads us to trouble. It tramples underfoot all ideals, he says, honoring anyone who says that he loves the people, and assigning a kind of equality indiscriminately to equals and unequals alike. I think both of those are worthy of observing. Anybody who loves the people, anybody who says he loves the people, in other words, anybody who promises the people that he will look out for their interests, is somebody who will gather a lot of popular support. But that person may or may not be interested in representing the interests of the people. And so, in short, it fosters demagogues. It fosters people who are charlatans. It fosters leaders who actually say one thing and do another. And so it encourages hypocrisy among the politicians, which is not a good thing. The people are in fact too easily misled by people who say the right things. It's one thing to say the right thing, it's another thing to do it. And they find themselves in a situation where the politicians all say they're on their side, but few of them actually are. But the other point is equally important. It assigns a kind of equality indiscriminately to equals and unequals alike. In other words, there's such a stress on democratic equality that divisions of merit, divisions of excellence are no longer observed. And so Plato recognized, as Nietzsche would recognize many, many centuries later, that democracy is something of an enemy of excellence. It is an enemy of people who actually achieve and merit achievement. It tends to say everybody's equal, everybody deserves equal treatment, even if they're in highly unequal circumstances and highly unequal degrees of merit. And so what tends to happen is that a democratic society undermines excellence. It undermines achievement, it undermines accomplishment, it undervalues all of these things, and leads to the promotion of equality among people who really should not be treated equally. That becomes a serious problem, and the level of excellence, the level of competence even, begins to decline in a democratic society. It also encourages so much freedom that it allows license. It encourages the darker parts of the soul, desire and emotion, to predominate over reason. That means that over time, the society becomes less and less rational. Not only individual people within it, but the society itself becomes less and less rational. More driven by base desires, more driven by emotional reactions to things. And it allows so much liberty that all sorts of depraved desires end up emerging. And so it becomes something that allows all sorts of behaviors that really should not be allowed. Destructive behaviors, behaviors that are destructive to the social fabric as well as to the individuals practicing them. As a result, Plato says, this is a society that tends to become decadent. It initially allows this flowering of liberty, the liberty turns into license, and that beautiful multicolored texture that he's talking about devolves into a decadent and ugly picture. He points out that parents, for example, start to imitate their children. The culture becomes oriented around youths. Citizens end up being treated no better than, or sometimes worse, than foreigners. And the society no longer draws any distinctions between them. He says even animals begin to be treated as equal to human beings. All of these, he says, are signs of equality where there should not be equality. Parents know more than children. Citizens have more of an investment in their society than foreigners do. And animals, however much they might have moral value, are not the equal of human beings. So in all of these cases, you're really taking people who ought to be treated unequally, or beings that ought to be treated unequally, and treating them equally. The result of that is a kind of failure of moral discrimination. People being indistinct and just acting as if everybody is equally deserving of respect, everybody is equally deserving of sympathy and consideration, and even promotion and adulation, when those things are not true, and it undermines the moral basis of society. He says liberty becomes license, which in the end becomes anarchy. People no longer obey the laws because, well, liberty. People should be treated equally whether they obey the law or not. And so criminals find themselves no longer punished. Ordinary people find themselves no longer protected. Plato ends up saying that democracies develop a structure of three classes. The idle and spendthrift, they pursue pleasure and constitute something like a lumpen proletariat. They are people who really just pursue pleasure for its own sake. They allow desire to run rampant in their souls. Then there are the orderly and thrifty. They tend to become rich. They work hard. They save their money. They do very well in such a society. They tend to be controlled by the rational part of the soul. And then the quiet cultivators. They own very little property. They're largely left out. They're in a better position probably than they would be in an oligarchic society. On the other hand, they don't really have the talent to become highly accomplished. They have the freedom to indulge themselves. They don't indulge themselves quite as much as that first group, but nevertheless, they really find themselves just getting by. And so those people end up feeling as if, well, they don't really have much stake in what's going on. In fact, they often end up feeling neglected and abused. The result of all that is that they look for somebody to protect them. They look for somebody who is going to look out for their interests. And they tend to look for, in other words, a populist leader. So populism arises at this stage of a democracy. A leader typically emerges who claims to speak for the people who are the forgotten people, the people in that third group who are left aside. Some groups are achieving, other groups are wildly pursuing pleasure, and the people who are just doing their jobs, coming home, and looking for something beyond the meager circumstances of their lives, they're looking for somebody to speak up for them. And they find it. They find a populist leader. Now that leader may be somebody who just says he's going to look out for them, but ideally they find somebody who really will look out for them. And that, basically, is the real hope for a democratic society at this stage, that such a person emerges, does speak for the forgotten people, and does manage to actually turn the society to their advantage and speak to their concerns. That person might succeed, and if they do, then this can be stabilized for a time. But there are tremendous pressures against them. And so not only the wealthy, but also that lumpen proletariat I mentioned, tend to be hostile to that populist leader and do everything they can to destroy him and drive him into exile, drive him out of political life within that society. If they succeed, then the last chance for stability is gone, and a democracy is doomed to collapse. In either case, it turns out that democracy is now fertile ground for tyranny. Either that populist leader is driven out and a tyrant emerges to express the interests of the wealthy and that lumpen proletariat class, pleasure-seeking class. Or that populist leader, him or herself, is under huge pressure to become tyrannical just to stay in power. And so what tends to happen at this point is that the populist leader loses out and a tyranny emerges. That's how a democracy ends up yielding to what is the worst form of government, government by a tyrant. I'll talk about that next time.